I think it's clear that there are elements of the Liberal Party that do have,
hang up about it.
Yeah, they do have. Thank you very much. Yeah, but it seems to me it can just as easily, perhaps even more easily, come from the Labor side, just because the Labor Party keeps losing, right? And when you keep losing, you start looking for ways to win. And so maybe, there is an element inside the Labor Party, for instance, that, Bob Carr, after the 2000 Olympic Games, said Sydney's full. How big a leap is it to get a national leader of the Labor Party saying Australia is full? Is that really such a big leap? I don't think so. So it seems to me it could come from either party. The reason I think this is a nice analogy with Brexit is that high immigration is a point of elite bipartisan consensus, just as the relations with the EU were in the UK. Okay, so this was a point of elite consensus which was never tested really with the population. So both major parties in the UK took it for granted that Britain's, slow, halting but gradual enmeshment with Europe was a good thing. And it seems to me, because these parties became so disconnected from the public in the way that I just described earlier, they failed to recognise that the public had not bought into this sentiment. Now, it's not that the public was against it necessarily. They just hadn't paid any attention to it, and they certainly weren't invested in it the way that the political class was in the UK. So when they did eventually make the mistake of asking, the British people came back with the wrong answer.
And the final area, and the one that Andrew and George will pick up and talk about in an Australian context, is really that we're part of three countries, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the CANS group, who have used for some time a quite sophisticated system of recruiting internationally and of identifying skills that are available around the world and then attracting those skills to them. For us, it's been a more recent story than it has been for Australia. So we went through a period when we changed in the late 1980s our immigration policy framework. The 1990s were a bit fraught, settled down after 2000, but then the GFC hit it, and you'll see what that means in terms of a graph in the moment. But increasingly, of course, given the things that I've talked about before, population growth will be driven by immigrants, not by anything onshore. And of course, it's a strong skills supply element to it, and we select about 60% of our immigrants according to economic criteria, as you do.
Paul, thanks for that presentation. I had to stop scribbling furiously because it was going to throw me off course on my presentation. There are some extraordinary continuities between Australia and New Zealand that you mentioned. What I want to do is walk you through where I think immigration policy in Australia fits in terms of our open economic model. And I view the immigration program the way it's functioning now, with the emphasis on skill, not just emphasis on skill, but the try before you buy aspect of it. Most of the recruiting we now do is onshore. So a bit over half the permanent settlers in Australia changed categories. So they were temporary migrants before they settled, and that's occurred in the last couple of years. Now, I view the way the program has evolved, and it's sort of evolved out of sight of the public, and I think a lot of politicians are not that clued up on what it means themselves. I've given a couple of presentations now internally to the public service in Australia on precisely this topic, that I don't think people understand how profound the changes we've had over the last 15 years in particular are. Now, one way to think about the migration program today is that it's become the fifth pillar of the open model. Now, the open model, as you've heard, Bob Hawke, Paul Keating and John Howard tell you ad infinitum, and we went one more time around the world for sport in the television documentary a couple of years ago for the ABC. It was essentially a process by which four of the main prices in the economy were taken off the cabinet table and handed over to the market. The floating of the dollar, the setting of interest rates independently of government by the Reserve Bank, Wages set at the enterprise level, and of course through the removal of the tariff wall, the absence of any government control over import prices or the quantity of imports. I would add migration as the fifth pillar for the following reasons. The government today does not have the control over the migration problem that it once did. And that is because it's demand driven and most of it is set by the market. So the numbers that come in, the government can control the flow, but the actual numbers that come into Australia in any given year is actually determined by the market and by education institutions. And the numbers themselves are quite profound. The only way to really get your head around it is to understand that we're adding an extra 1 million people a decade because of overseas migration. In each decade after the Second World War, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s and the 90s, population grew by about 2 million a decade. So rate of growth is actually declining because the number is pretty static. And a bit over half of that population growth for each decade after the Second World War was net natural increase. Now, for the last 3 decades of the last 2 decades of the 20th century, I'll give you the net overseas migration figure. I'll annualise it for you just to make it a bit easier. It was a bit over 100,000 in the 80s, and it was around 80,000 in the 90s. Of course, there's an interruption of a very, very deep recession in the early part of the 90s there. The first decade alone of the 21st century, and you should be aware of this headline number, but understand what this thing means. Population didn't grow by 2 million a decade, it grew by 3 million a decade. Now that extra million has come from overseas. Whereas in the previous decade, the 1990s, net overseas migration about 80,000 a year. We got 180,000 a year in the first decade alone of the 21st century. Now, take the annual rate now, based on the data for the last 4 years, it's a bit over 200,000 a year. That is the big profound shift. And the reason, as I said, it's, if you look at it as the fifth pillar and it's demand driven, growing uninterrupted for 25 years is one of the reasons why you'd be adding this many migrants. But the other reason we're adding this many migrants is that the Chinese and Indians are choosing us. And the Chinese and Indians are emigrating at a rate that has no comparison in human history outside of the 19th century. And think about what the Chinese and Indians are doing. These are two rising nations, but their middle class is emigrating for the same reasons roughly that the British were emigrating in the 19th century. The middle class is moving because they're leaving a political system that's not quite ideal for them, an environment that's degraded, cities that are overcrowded. They're actually moving for opportunity. And even though notionally we're recruiting them, it's their choice to come here that is actually driving a lot of the policy challenges, I think, in the next few years for people. Now that's just the headline figure. Now the detail. Today in Australia, there are a little over 1 million people born in either China or India. For the first time on record, that 1 million from the two biggest countries on earth outnumber the British in Australia. So that's a big stat. Now the median age for an English-born Australian is about 54, 55. The median age for a Chinese or Indian-born Australian is in the mid-30s. It's a bit lower for the Indians, it's a bit higher for the Chinese. So half your English-born population in Australia, essentially retirees, more than half your Chinese and Indian-born population in Australia are in the process of becoming your new middle or even your elites. Now this is the other part of the migration program I think very few politicians have got their heads around. Most of the migrants that arrive today don't come to Australia via the same route that pretty much we are familiar with. Story of my parents, story of pretty much, I'd imagine, a lot of people in this room. The post-war migration program begins with a low-skilled worker, and you measure the success of the program in two ways. The fact that the low-skilled migrant took a job, was able to acquire property, but critically, through their kids, their Australian-born kids, they overachieved. And we know that the kids of non-English-speaking immigrants outperform all others in their peer group. And that's a pretty stable statistic. It's not just an Australian story, it's actually a story you see played out around the world. Most of the migrants who have arrived in the last 15 years don't start at the bottom and get to the top via their kids, they start at the top.
And you're right, in botany, 55% of people were born overseas. I've got a very diverse electorate committee there that represents all of those interests in that electorate. So what I can reassure you is that we are talking to people already who are reaching out to us. We're reaching out to people and having those conversations. And I've got no doubt we'll have a really diverse representative slate of candidates for 2023.
I flagged it in the presentation. One of the big challenges, I think, and you see it in real time because of the quality of the bulk of the intake. Not everybody shares this story, but if the predominant migrant today, if the majority of migrants today are landing roughly in the middle or the very top of the social structure, you have very, very simple question to ask about how does the rest of the population keep up. Now, sadly, the Indigenous disadvantage story, which is almost impossible for governments to get their heads around, and you've just seen the sort of chopping and changing even on the Northern Territory issue, where you see something on TV, the thing that's in the back of the public mind suddenly becomes front of mind, which is that essentially 2% of the population is not sharing the story of the last 25 years or even the story of 220-something years. And so governments go, okay, another Royal Commission, hang on a minute, we didn't think that through, 2 commissioners, not 1. 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now, ask yourselves a couple of questions. Your tertiary sector in education is on a big revenue-driven model via overseas students. Your schools, especially as the kids of the skilled intake come into the system, your schools are starting to crowd out local-born kids, simply because there aren't enough schools. And I think the story essentially for most people who can default to the private system at great expense, expense to the household budget, is that they assume there'll be a place for their kid there if their kid doesn't get a selective school, or or you don't have a good public school in your area. Think about what's going to happen in the next few years where there's scarcity, where Australians previously assumed almost universal access. And this is the local-born population, not the Indigenous population, it's the local-born population I'm talking about. If you start to get to a situation in Australia where you have Indigenous plus local-born disadvantage, and it's driven primarily because we're on a default setting because the migration program is keeping the macro data ticking over, then take the anecdote of Victoria public transport system and then take it across the education system. You can't catch this thing up if you let it go. Mm-hmm. Literally can't catch it up. Because then you've got the political cycle taking over, where you start to get a lot of knee-jerk responses that say, cut the program.
Massey University sociologist and population expert, Paul Spoonley joins me now. Paul, good to have you on the program again.
Good morning, Dunk.
What would New Zealand first be demanding, do you think, around immigration? If it's so important to Winston Peters and such a bottom line, what does his policy say?
Well, I think the first thing, I'm not sure exactly what his policy. I had a good look last night. He said skilled migration down to 10,000. I don't know what that means. Does that mean net gain? Does it mean that you can't bring family members, so it's only principal applicants? So there's a whole lot of things that are very unclear in terms of that policy. Some of the other bits, I think, are... Yeah, go on.
No, I was going to say, if we limit skilled migration to that 10,000, you won't build 100,000 homes, you won't build roads.
No.
You won't do stuff.
No, we'd be stuffed.
So that'll be my first thought, but I'm interested in what the New Zealand perspective is and how anyone has been thinking about these things in New Zealand.
Well, there's New Zealanders in the room who would be as competent as I am to answer it. But the New Zealand situation is the same, but there's a few complicating factors. So we do the same polling as Andrew has been doing, and this is for the Asian New Zealand Foundation, and the responses have been trending upwards, except for the Maori respondents, and they're trending down. So there's a political cultural dimension in which they see some of the exclusion from the education market or the labour market as being an issue, but they're also deeply concerned that the diversification of New Zealand's demographic base is then going to change the balance. And I don't know whether you noticed, but that already the Asian communities of Auckland are larger than the combined Maori and Pasifika communities of Auckland.
New Zealand has a very soft citizenship and set of expectations around immigrants. If you are accepted as a permanent resident, you have all the rights of citizenship. You cannot be a member of parliament, you cannot be a member of the Secret Service, everything else you can be. You can arrive, Anna can come, spend 3 months, which is the residency requirement for being a member of a particular electorate, and vote. And so it's structured, but structured in a slightly different way. But we continue the narratives around the importance of migration in terms of what we're building. And of course, the way in which we manage the resulting diversity and increasingly super diversity. And I argue, as I'm sure you do and accept, is that there was a turn that came through the 1980s when it became very strongly focused on economic drivers and economic considerations. And the pandemic, I think, has just underscored that in the way in which we look to migrants for economic benefit and to fit particular labour market shortages.
Thank you, Yasmina and Paul, please.
The question of treaty-based treaties being part of the framework for immigration, absolutely. And as I'm sure here, is that the disconnect between our colonial history with Indigenous and Aboriginal peoples and our immigration policies has been absolutely kept apart in various ways. And so there is a move began last year by the Productivity Commission to see that the treaty, New Zealand Treaty, Te Tiriti, should be at the very core of all immigration policy. And what you could do is you could take some of the non-state Indigenous values. Manaakitanga is the idea of helping people, and you bed them into immigration policy. So the question is really one of delivery, of how that actually occurs, particularly when you understand that Indigenous and migrant communities often live in different worlds, both in a territorial but in a discursive sense as well. I did the biography of our most noted Maori radical academic, a guy called Ranginui Walker, and Ranginui said that our immigration policies were too liberal, and he saw three things happening: a new demography, a demography when those communities outnumbered Maori, that their languages were heard more often than Te Reo Maori language, and that they were much more competitive in an education and job market. So there are some tensions, and how do we address those tensions?
I'll make this short and sweet. I'm Josh Clark, kia ora. My question's more to Dr. Paul Spoonley. You talked a little bit about how multicultural can probably support biculturalism. I'm just interested to hear what kind of strategies, as New Zealand does become more, as you know, more multicultural.
Kia ora, Josh. I think Ranginui has a view on this. Can I just give mine and allow Ranginui the right to add his? Immigration has provided New Zealand with a very different set of demographic and political dynamics. As I mentioned in the speech, this country has transformed itself through immigration in a way that very few other countries have post-2000. What I think is very disappointing is that the treaty has not been part of the policy discussions, but also that Maori have not been given the role of welcoming those new immigrants here. I think the immigration relationship, if you like, has left Maori out, and that is a position which is unsustainable, and something needs to be done about it.
The preamble to the treaty is New Zealand's first immigration policy, that the chiefs signing that treaty had agreed to the fact that there were British people coming here to New Zealand, the Queen's people, and they needed to be cared for. But in our own time, immigration has become a tool of economic development, and this is what I personally am opposed to. My strategy is pull up the drawbridge.
What happened to looking after, looking after Middle New Zealand?
Yeah, so isn't the issue, if you just take the issue with housing, I mean, irrelevant of, where you think people are coming from, which ethnicity, whether they're coming from overseas or they're coming from Invercargill, I mean, the bottom line is, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but there's no evidence I've seen that suggests that the demographers are wrong when they say 1 million people are coming to Auckland over the next 30 to 50 years. And I just think it's going to happen because big cities grow. If you look in Australia, I mean, Sydney's getting bigger, Melbourne's getting bigger. This is an international city, and it's just a magnet for economic activity, and it's drawing people in. So whatever your view of where people are coming from, we can't put a big fence around it. So all we can do is fix the supply and demand issue. So there's a couple of things. One, we've got to keep interest rates low. That's why we bang on all the time about managing the economy well. And I think the budget's demonstrated we're doing that. But that's keeping interest rates low. That's helping. Second thing is we've given the Reserve Bank more tools so they don't have to whack up interest rates and can alter things. But the third thing is, in the end, the reason house prices are going up is because there's not enough supply. There's 4,000 homes being built for 13,000 demand. And so what you've got to do, I think, is support what we're doing, which is realistically get out there and say, through the councils, we just have to have those 13,000 homes built. If we do that, you will get into a first home. Because I'm with you. I think it's the Kiwi dream to own a home, and it should be real and live.
Well, I sort of accept that, but I live in East Auckland, and I'm a sales rep. And I'm driving around and I'm seeing all the different schools and I'm seeing hotels, etc. And every place I go that happens to be for sale, and I've got some people in property and da-da-da as well. Everywhere I go, I was at a motel. There's an auction on the 28th in Mount Wellington of a hotel, and even the real estate agent said everyone from China will buy it, bowl it, and put up apartments. And that every section for sale, etc., etc. Even the buildings. Some of the buildings in Howick Pakuranga, Botany area, only have, and I sound like a complete racist, and I'm not. My wife's Norwegian, but they've only got Asian writing on it.
All right, I got the point. I'm not being rude. I just want to get through as many calls as I can. So
I mean, look, in the end, you are going to see investment coming from all sorts of different places. I mean, I hear the argument that they are investing and they're not living in the properties, and that's forcing first-home buyers out. But look, if you do that, you end up having to pay a capital gains tax, irrelevant of any changes, because the IRD look at you, and if that's the purpose of buying it, then you get caught.
This is your thing.
Yeah, okay, so property, there's three things that drive property, I'm sure you all know this. So essentially, interest rates, jobs and migration. So they are the three big factors. And essentially why they're pretty much in that order is that if you go and borrow money to buy a house, just let's take residential for a moment, then pretty simply people go along and say, how much can I, they work backwards. Fundamentally, how much do I earn? How much can therefore I afford to pay? And let's say your mortgage is 2.5% at the moment, for one an argument. Then the banks actually chuck in their models much higher numbers, over double that. So they stress test themselves that you can afford it when rates go up a bit. It doesn't mean that it doesn't have quite a big impact. So it's all about interest rates, and if you believe they're going to track up, they'll have some impact. Jobs, can people keep paying the mortgage? Migration is quite a big factor. So it has been, saying the blindly obvious, going crazy. So just to give you an example, what we call system growth, how much do the banks lend in residential? On average, that's 15 billion a year. Just to give you an example, in the last 12 months, it's been 30 billion. So ANZ, We are 1 in 3 home loans. We're the biggest in the country. And just to give you an example, September, October, November, December, we just at ANZ, we lent $1 billion a month. Just ANZ.
Wow.
So we're lending 15 billion a year now at the moment.
And that's to New Zealand or New Zealand and Australia?
No, just New Zealand. That's just New Zealand. So it is going nuts out there. Now, I mean, some things are changing.
A country like New Zealand, we don't have enough defence forces to protect ourselves. If someone wanted to come and invade New Zealand tomorrow or do something really bad to us, they could, right? I mean, our Navy is about 3 boats, and I've got friends who own more boats than the New Zealand Navy. You know what I mean? Like, you just go on and on. I mean, the Air Force was a batch of clapped out planes, and, you know, we don't have much, right?
Changing immigration policy in the debate that followed, with some political leaders horrifically using terms like Asian invasion. Without perhaps being aware of it at the time, New Zealand was observing the deployment of one of the most effective tools available to a politician should they choose to amplify and deploy it. And that tool is fear. There may have been many times in our history where fear has been present. The Great Depression, world wars, living through a pandemic. But there is a difference between a genuine fear and politically motivated and generated one. Fear can be used to excuse action or inaction. We see it used to motivate people to do things that usually they wouldn't consider. Fear of migration, diversity, equality, fear that someone is getting resources that you will be deprived of, fear that your way of life is threatened. Fear is one of the quickest and easiest pathways to blame. And why would a politician be enticed to use such a tool? Because by blaming others, you immediately remove the need to find solutions yourself.
The idea of equality, equal opportunities and the fair distribution of wealth has long been a core value for most New Zealanders. But here in Auckland, the rapid rise in house values and rents and an acute shortage of social housing means that for many families, like the one living in this garage, housing has become a huge challenge. For many, it's too much. We found dozens of families sleeping in their cars next to a park south of the city. They were unwilling to talk to us on camera, but told us that despite having jobs, they were still unable to find a house to rent.
Where house prices rise, in the last 4 years, for example, are up 85%. And for most of that time, rents didn't rise nearly as fast. But just in the last couple of years, it's starting to overflow into rents. And that's putting enormous pressure on those people who have relatively low incomes and incomes that aren't growing very fast.
And when I look back and look at what's happening at the moment, then many of the frameworks and the approaches that we developed through those very difficult decades in the 70s and 80s, both particularly in Europe, not so much in this country, then I think they continue to have relevance today. There are some changes. The Great Replacement is obviously part of the same theme of these groups imagining a racial threat.
What did you make of Winston Peters' comments yesterday? He put out a press release after the migration figures were released, criticising a media article and the journalists who wrote it.
Yes. Well, let me be polite. I thought it was disgraceful. I think the fact that he called something that the Herald had carefully researched propaganda, and he referred to the ethnicity, which is Asian, of the 2 journalists, absolutely disgraceful.
Read you a couple of quotes and ask you to describe your feelings towards them. 2 wrongs don't make a white. How do you feel about that?
Look, if you're going to start quoting Winston Peters at me, I've been very clear that I don't intend to work with Winston Peters after the election.
I get that. But he also called New Zealand the last Asian colony. How do you feel about that? What about we've now reached the point where you can wander down Queen Street and wonder if you're in New Zealand or some other country. My problem is he said all of these things before you went into coalition with him in 2017, and now suddenly you've had a come to Jesus moment and realise that he's not the most savoury character.
Yeah, it's hard not to
to be too dramatic on this, because I think, you know, we talk about existential threats, and I think we've also discussed inside COI 2 the threats to our social democracy. And if people haven't looked at the Edelman Trust Barometer, then I would suggest that you do, because I think it sums up some of our challenges. So this is the 2023 Edelman Trust Barometer, which is a huge international survey. And what they talk about is the combination of the collapse of economic optimism, the decline in trust in government that Peter has talked about. They've discovered in talking to people around the world that the media are seen as fueling distrust, and they talk about severe polarization. And it's quite interesting. They've got various rankings, and it might come as a surprise that when people in countries self-define, the most divided country by those inside that country is the Netherlands, followed by Brazil, Sweden, and France. And one of the things that came out, which I think applies here, is that people are feeling very pessimistic about the social fabric of their countries. And they've got two quotes that I wouldn't mind just reading out. The first is, "The lack of civility and mutual respect is the worst I have ever seen." And around the high-income world, 65% of people responding to the Edelman survey affirmed that it was the worst they've ever seen. But the second one is that the social fabric that once held this country together has grown too weak to serve as a foundation for unity and common purpose. And again, the figure affirming that was 62%. And I think even in recent days, we've seen the way in which respect and trust are beginning to play out or not play out in terms of this election. So to riff off Peter's point, I think one of the things that you see in Edelman, and one of the things that you see inside New Zealand, is the relatively rapid decline in trust in core institutions, but also the lack of respect. And so there are 7 countries that are defined by Edelman. New Zealand is not one of them, by the way, by Edelman as being severely polarized and as not seeing a way back from those that polarization. So Brazil, Sweden, the USA are in those 7. And I think we're all faced by the issue of how do we restore trust and how do we restore respect? And to come to the question, Hema, I look at what's happened with the local elections, where there was, in my view, disengagement. I look at the experiences of Stats New Zealand collecting census data when there was often outright hostility. And I think a barometer, to use the Edelman word, the barometer for us is going to be the next few weeks leading up to the election. And it will, I think, provide us with an example of how far that trust has declined between communities, between parties, and between government and its citizens.
Look, I think obviously this is not the result we either hoped for or wanted, but as you say, politics can be brutal. And I think that Chris summed it up really well last night when he said, tides that come in also go out.
Peter?
Well, I think it's worth going back a bit before COVID, that, fundamental to people's sense of comfort in society is stability. And we've said we're in a period of very rapid change, be it technological, economic, social, environmental. And there's a lot of scholarly evidence that rapid change leads to increased anxiety, and increased anxiety is associated with a loss of trust. And the default position, as we quote in our most recent report, in New Zealand, there's more than 50% of people start with a distrusting default position. If we look at it in terms of what's happened in the last few years with COVID, with the way in which political discourse has occurred or not occurred over important matters, it's quite destabilising. So we've seen that New Zealand media has a particularly low trust rating on surveys. There's been a decline in trust in the police, which might relate to the way they had to operate in COVID, in the way in which they had to handle protests in Wellington and so forth, and perhaps related to perceptions of crime. And loss of trust in the police is a good reflection of loss in trust in a number of civic institutions. Against all of that, and our second report comments on a lot of ways in which the way in which the political system has operated in the last few years, and not just only related to the current government, in the way OIAs are responded to, many other factors are responded to. There's many compounding factors that can make people sceptical of how governments respond and act. Then on top of that, the way that the digital milieu has both in itself and in the way the political communicators have responded has led to more and more ad hominem rather than ideological discourse, such that in the United States, for example, effective polarization is defined by the fact that it's not policies that that separate Republicans voters from Democratic voters. It's rather their view of the other side that separates them. Now, we're not that far down that path, but you can see in the way in which the discourse is going that it is at risk. I mean, many commentators are scared of how the rhetoric between the major political parties may play out over coming weeks. Now, all of that comes to make people more and more skeptical of the very system that democracy requires for a democratic large-scale society to function. So I think that if one could have a magic wand and hope that politicians might debate policy rather than people and identity, it would be very helpful. Unfortunately, I think neither the news media nor the digital milieu make that a likely outcome. I think that the more immediate question, which you alluded to earlier, Paul, and you alluded to me making a point about this, I think core to this is how do you reinstate institutional trust? Because institutional trust is declining in the democracies, and there are different components to that. But one of the most important components of a democracy is people feeling that they have a sense of agency and impact over their own lives, which of course is what distinguishes it from a strong autocracy. And I think these new models that we employ in Koi2 experimentally of both digital and in-person bottom-up consultation leading to informing policy decision-making, as are most extensively now used in countries like Taiwan, are in fact probably the best way to give people confidence again in the decision-making processes of a democracy. I think the presumption, which is I think only partially proven in an empirical sense, is people can accept decisions that they don't agree with if they feel their voice has been heard. And I think that's where the current political dynamic does not assure people that their voice has been heard. And I think that the kinds of methodologies that Anne Barsley, Tatiana, and others are using with both digital and in-person approaches allows people to feel their voices again being heard. And I think that the future, as you suggested, a lot of this is about bottom-up empowerment, bottom-up engagement of people, and the potential of using digital techniques, as is now used in Taiwan, to make people feel their voices heard, not in a yes-no simple way, but in a much more sophisticated, nuanced way, is probably important in rebuilding institutional trust. Equally, however, I think some of the cynicism that many in officialdom use, like last-minute consultations on the Friday before Christmas or something like that, are the kinds of things that undermine social cohesion. In terms of horizontal trust, again, I think local empowerment makes it more likely that social trust will emerge, because so many decisions can be made at a local level that are now made centrally, and that requires people to talk to each other. And it's interesting, we talked earlier about the fact that 7 countries are identified as particularly fractured but in Finkel's paper on effective polarisation in science, he highlights New Zealand as one at particular risk. So, you know, which is in Science in 2021. So I think we shouldn't be relaxed. I think we should be looking carefully at ourselves at every scale, from family through to national, and in fact, in terms of our relationships more globally, in terms of what can we do to enhance both institutional and social trust.